So now that we've completed talking about our ideal perfectly competitive market, we're next going to turn and consider other market structures where we don't have a perfectly competitive market. And we're going to start with the other extreme, right? If one of the end of the extreme we have a perfectly competitive market, at the other extreme, it's when we have a monopoly. Rather than having many producers that are all competing against each other, if we just have one producer who's the sole producer in the market, that's a monopoly, right? And so I think of this really as a story about power, right? And we think about those who tend to have power tend to use it in a way that furthers their objectives, right? And so, not surprisingly, to give away the punchline, right, these monopolists who have power, they're going to use that market power in a way to try to get more favorable prices and profitability for them, right? And so that's the intuition. Now we can spend a little bit of time going through how we get to there and how we see that in the model. So like any of the market structures, we start with the assumptions. And real quick, as a question, as a review question, what are the 4 assumptions of a perfectly competitive market? And I ask for you to review those perfectly competitive assumptions so that in your mind you can compare and contrast how they are similar or different from the assumptions in a monopoly market, right? So our first assumption is, in a monopoly market, that we have a single seller, right? And again, think about how that compares to a perfectly competitive market. That single seller, right, they've got the power in the market. Not surprisingly, they're going to use that power to their advantage to end up in a better position. Implicit in this, right, if you recall, the perfectly competitive analog to this was we also said something about the number of buyers, where we assumed there were many buyers. In this monopoly market, let's go ahead and keep that implicit assumption that we've got a bunch of consumers, so that one individual consumer has no ability to influence the market price. They don't have a lot of power. But now with this monopolist, because they're the only one in the market, that's their source of power, right? And that's what they're going to use to their advantage to get more favorable prices and higher profitability, right? Again, if you're a monopolist and you're the only one in the market, right, if you decide to raise your prices, what are buyers going to do? Do they have other options? Maybe. But you're definitely you definitely don't have any other sellers that you have to compete with, and so that's definitely a source of power. The second half of this assumption, we do have a single seller in the market, but that single seller in the market faces the entire market demand curve, right? So as a reminder, the demand curve is a downward sloping line. The monopolist might want to try to achieve more favorable prices, right? Higher prices. But notice when they face the entire market demand, if they're going to try to raise their prices, what's going to happen? Quantity demanded is going to fall, right? I alluded to this half a second ago. Do buyers have any ability or any power in this market? They do, right? If a monopolist starts raising their prices, some buyers may choose to leave the market. Some buyers may choose to buy less. That's the source of buyers' power in the market. It's not as strong as sellers, but there is some power by buyers. It's just there's even more power concentrated on the seller's side of the market. But this is not in a completely innocuous thing, right? You can think about some of these drugs that get produced that when they're under their patent protection, this is supposed to be a drug, when they're under patent protection, right, that drug company, if they're the only producer of a certain drug or a pill, right, can they charge anything they want for those pills? No, they can charge higher prices for those pills, but they can't charge $10 million per pill. Why not? Because people will leave the market. People will step out and not buy it, right? And that ability to leave the market if they don't like the price, that's one way that buyers are able to get some amount of power in the market. Not nearly as much as what the sellers have when we compare it to what a perfectly competitive market is. Number 2 assumption, there are no good economic substitutes, right? So with economic substitutes, what we're talking about is things that people feel they could substitute one good for the other. And so I give the classic example when you think about a local utility, right? So if you have an apartment or a house, typically your options for getting electricity are you have one company that you can go to. In a sense, that's a monopoly, right? And so I can ask, are there good substitutes for electricity? Well, if we put on our engineering hat, right, we can think of a bunch of different ways that you could try to get power into your house. You could install some solar panels. You could do some wind turbines. You could maybe run a diesel generator. There's a bunch of things that you could do, But that's not what we're thinking of here. It's not what you could technically do, but rather it's economically. Do consumers view them as being a reasonable economic substitutes? Would consumers actually switch to these other alternative sources, right? And so what we have with a monopoly is no, right? They're the only one in the market, and what they're producing doesn't have very good substitutes. And so then that's, again, what helps establish them as a monopoly is that there's this no ability by consumers to run to other alternatives. Barriers to entry. If you recall, barriers to entry are those things that make new competition more difficult. In a perfectly competitive market, we assume there were no barriers to entry. We're assuming there are barriers to entry, right? A monopolist is going to use their power in the market as a single seller to their advantage to get higher prices and more favorable profitability. Remember, when you've got a market, if there is some profit in a market, Adam Smith says that's a signal for others to try to jump into that market. In a perfectly competitive market, anybody can jump into that market and dilute the level of profitability of a firm. But for a monopolist, they've got some kind of barrier to entry that prevents new competition from joining the market. All decision makers have perfect information. Again, this is the same assumption that we assumed on the perfectly competitive market. We're going to maintain this assumption for a little bit. Everybody knows what's going on, right? The monopolist understands what their cost structure looks like. They understand what consumer demand looks like so that they can make accurate predictions about prices and quantities. It's not that consumers are going to be in a worse off position because they don't know any better. Consumers know exactly what the deal is. Consumers are in a worse position because they don't have power, right? So real quickly, we've got number of sellers, we've got barriers to entry, we've got an assumption about perfect information. This second assumption that we list here, what is the analog in a perfectly competitive market? In the perfectly competitive set of assumptions, what's the analog to this assumption number 2, and is it the same or is it different? In this section, we wanted to talk a little bit about different types of barriers to entry, right? In a perfectly competitive market, we assumed that there were no barriers to entry so that anyone could jump into the market and eat into the profitability of existing firms, right? That jumping into the market increased the supply, which put downward pressure on prices, which reduced the profitability in a perfectly competitive market. But now, in a monopoly market, that doesn't happen, right? We assume that there's something that makes new entrants into the market their job more difficult, right? It's more difficult or maybe impossible for them to jump in and compete in this market. And so those barriers to entry, they come in a couple of different forms. And so we want to just highlight here a couple of the different ways that barriers to entry, different types of them, right? And again, this isn't necessarily just about a monopoly, but any time that you've got a market where there's something that makes new competition more difficult to join, that absolutely might have an impact on some of the outcomes. So some classic ones, right? Legal or political barriers to entry. We mentioned earlier these patent-protected drugs, right? When a new drug is developed, at some point, the drug company applies for a patent, right? So typically the way that this works is a little bit of background, is they apply for the patent along the drug development process, right? And so they apply for the patent before it actually comes out into the market. Patents only last for a certain amount of time. And this is in a business law class, so I'm not going to get into the details of the length and all of those things. But right, they apply for the patent, and then after it's developed and it's on the market, their patent is going to cover a certain amount of time on the market. But once that patent ends, then generics can enter the market, right? This is an oversimplification of what the story is, but in general, right, that those patents allow a little bit of market exclusivity. Those patents allow or act as a barrier to entry. So usually I ask the question, if a drug company has a patent on a drug, does that mean that no one can produce their drug? That doesn't actually mean that, right? Other companies could produce their drug and try to sell it in the market, but what that patent does is it gives that company that holds the patent intellectual property rights, which means they can go to court and sue for economic damages, and it's the threat of that that keeps firms out of the market. So again, that's a legal barrier to entry, right? It's not a 100% airtight barrier to entry saying no one else can produce this, but it's saying that if someone else tries to produce this, there's legal recourse, and that is usually the threat that acts as a barrier to entry, right? The other one that we mentioned half a second ago was the idea about electric companies, right? So a lot of local utilities, water companies, electric companies, those sorts of things, there's usually just one option, right? That's a political decision about letting one company serve a specific geographic area, right? But again, it acts as a barrier to entry through some kind of political regulation. Those are big, those are important, but they're not the only forms of barriers to entry, right? Another barrier to entry is, we can refer to some economic barriers to entry. So I've got three concepts that harken back to an earlier topic: economies of scale, economies of scope, and the experience curve. As a review, in your own words, what does it mean if an industry experiences economies of scale? Right? And so the main takeaway of the economies of scale is that bigger is better. Bigger is able to do production at a lower per unit cost. And so it means, right, that was the story where we had all those little boxes and we could do a big 30 acres, or we could have 31 acre farms, right? The idea of economies of scale is that big firms are able to produce at a lower per unit cost. So what does that mean? That means if we do have economies of scale, then there's incentive for firms to merge together and get bigger and bigger because it drives down the cost. But once we have one big firm that's able to produce at a lower per unit cost, how easy is it going to be for a smaller mom and pop to try to open up and compete against this larger firm, right? The smaller firms, by definition, when we have economies of scale, smaller scale firms aren't able to compete with lower costs against the larger firms. There's nothing that government is doing right now. This is entirely a function of the production process and the cost structure in the industry, not about the government. It's completely an economic dynamic in that industry that creates this difficulty for new competition to join and try to compete against existing producers, right? And similar things for the experience curve and the economies of scope, right? These are cost advantages for certain types of firms. If certain types of firms, based on what they produce or how long they've been in the industry, if those kinds of things make new competition more difficult, that could be a barrier to entry. And again, nothing about the government created this situation, right? The government absolutely had a hand in creating the legal and political barriers to entry, but the government is doing nothing here. This is a completely natural barrier to entry, natural, that is, based on the production and the cost dynamics of the industry. So those are some important barriers to entry to think about, but they're not the only ones, right? We've got this ownership of a key resource, and so the stylized and not 100% accurate example that gets told in a lot of economics class has to do with diamonds, right? And so I think I'm probably going to post a link to a nice little version of this story, but the classic example is that diamonds are basically come from a very narrow strip of land. When we think globally, there's not that much land that can produce diamonds, and so those people who own the land that produces diamonds, they're by de facto going to be a monopolist, right? That's the argument. Again, it's a little bit stylized when we talk about the De Beers family owning all the diamonds. That's not quite totally accurate, but it's a nice little story. This fourth one that we're going to talk about, social and cultural, right? So again, when I think about this, factors related to social issues or cultural issues that, again, we're talking about barriers to entry. So we're talking about if you've got a new competitor trying to join a market, something that makes it difficult, right? And so the classic example that I usually tell, right, is if you've got a couple of different auto shops in a town, right, that are run by different mechanics. Could anyone jump into that market? Now, let's assume that this new entrant to the market has all the skills and they've got reasonable costs, so it's not anything else going on. But if this person who is trying to join the market, what if they were a female mechanic? Would they find, based on their gender, a little bit more difficulty in acquiring clients and being successful? Again, totally independent of their qualifications and their ability, their productivity, but might gender hamper their ability to be successful in a new industry, right? And so you can think there are a number of examples where gender or race or ethnicity might cause it a little bit more difficult for a new entrant to join a market and be successful. And so those kinds of things can also act as a potential barrier to entry, right? If you are yeah, if in general, right, those kind of social dynamics are going on, then there's barriers to entry. And so if we think about the long history of the US, you can probably pretty easily think about a number of examples where social or cultural factors have been a barrier to entry, and you can think about how the dynamic of them has changed through time. But it's not something we want to totally ignore. In our class, for our purposes, we're going to focus primarily on the legal political ones, which are very clear and straightforward, and then the economic ones we're gonna come back and mention those again in a second. So now we want to consider a monopolist, and I want to ask a question a couple of times. In general, my question is, what quantity should a firm produce to maximize profit? Do you recall the answer to that question? When we were thinking about a perfectly competitive market, right, that very first most important cost curve that we used it to figure out the quantity the firm should produce in order to maximize profit. When we were looking at a competitive market, the answer to that question was where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And I'm going to write it out here, and I'm going to star it 7 times because it's so, I'm going to do more than 7 because it really is just so important, right? This is ideally how firms make a decision based on their costs, based on their revenue, about what they should do in order to maximize profit. They set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. It turns out that what quantity a firm should produce to maximize profit, the answer to that question is always where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, regardless of the market structure, regardless of whether we have a perfectly competitive market or a monopolist or some other market structure. It's always where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So in order to do that, in order to get to this point, we've got to think about what does marginal revenue look like for a monopolist. In order to get to marginal revenue, we've got to first think about total revenue. So a motivator for this. That monopolist, we say that that monopolist has control over the market price. Remember, a firm in a perfectly competitive market, they had to take whatever the price is as a given. They were a price taker in a perfectly competitive market. But a monopolist, they're the only one in the market. And so what it means is that they get to control the market price. But there's another part here, subject to consumer demand, right? Consumers are still free to walk away from a market. They face the entire demand curve, so if a monopolist, they can control the market price, but if they try to raise the price, they will lose some customers, right? That inverse relationship comes from the demand curve, and this monopolist is the only one in the market, and so they have to face this demand curve. If they do get to choose the price, but they don't have unlimited discretion on what the price will be, price and quantity at the same time, right? When they choose their price, they're also choosing the quantity, or when they choose the quantity, they choose the price. But those two things, they can't maximize both of those at the same time, right? They can raise prices, but they will lose some quantity demanded. Okay, let's think about this for half a second. I've got a little equation here that describes a demand curve, P equals 100 minus 10 QD. Would you feel comfortable graphing this out? Make sure that this little picture matches what your intuition would be about how to graph out this market, right? Again, we're measuring price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal, because that's where they always go. We have a downward sloping linear demand curve, right? It's a nice little straight line, and that's what this equation is telling us. The vertical intercept is 100. That's if they charge a price of 100, they're not going to sell anything whatsoever. If they lower their price, right, and that corresponds to this little combination of price quantity that I have in this table, the very first row, right? If the way they price it at 100, they're not going to sell anything. If they lower the prices and they sell them at $90, they're going to sell 1 unit, right? And so on and so on. Because they're a monopolist and because they face the entire demand curve, if they lower the price, lower and lower and lower, they're going to be able to sell higher and higher amounts, right? As they lower the price lower and lower, the quantity that consumers are willing to buy is going to get higher and higher and higher. But notice I've got my horizontal intercept, right? My horizontal intercept is a quantity of 10 if they were giving it away for free. If this monopolist is selling it at a price of 0, if they're giving it away for free, they're going to sell 10 units. But gosh, how great is it to sell something for a price of 0? Not usually, right? So step 1, price quantity. Make sure that you understand the relationship between this equation, this graph, and then these lines, or these different rows of price quantity combinations. The next thing we want to add to it is this row of total revenue. Now, if you recall, total revenue is equal to price times quantity. Go through and verify in your mind these values, right? They sell a price of 0, they're not going to sell anything, so that's no revenue. If they price it at 90, they'll sell 1 unit, which they'd bring in $90 of revenue. If they priced it at $80, they would have sold 2 units, which would be a total revenue of $160. Again, make sure that you understand where all those values come from. And then my next question is, what would total revenue look like? If you graphed out this total revenue equation, or not, the graph of what these total revenue values look like, what would the shape of total revenue be for this monopolist? Right? And so I'm hoping it's pretty obvious, but in general, right, total revenue, how do we want to graph this thing out? If we want to graph this thing out, quantity, total revenue, let's see, it starts at 0 and it ends at 0. What happens in between? What happens in between is it looks like it goes higher, 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 hits a peak, goes down. Do you notice though, where is the point where total revenue hits its peak? It is at a quantity of 5. Is the quantity of 5 special? It is, right? Why is the quantity of 5 special? Because it is exactly the halfway point on the demand curve, right? So the horizontal intercept is 10. If you cut it right in half, it'd be 5. And that point on the demand curve corresponds to where total revenue is at its maximum, right? Next thing we want to look at is, the next column is marginal revenue, right? So if you recall, marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So I'm going to do the long version of this, right? We don't define it for the first unit, but for the second unit, we go from a quantity of 0 to 1. Total revenue went from 0 to 90. So that's equal to 90 minus 0 divided by 1 minus 0, 90. Marginal revenue is 90 for that first quantity. For the second quantity, again, the long version for 1 quick second, 160 minus 90 divided by 2 minus 1. Mathematically, this is 70. And, real quick, take a second and fill out the rest of this list. Real quick, verify those are the numbers that you got when you did your calculation. The way that this table is set up, this should be fairly easy, right? Because you've got the quantity increases by 1 for each, so you're really just saying, how much does total revenue go up by, right? It goes up by 90, then 70, then 50, then 30, then 10, then it falls by 10. Negative 10 is the change. Negative 30, negative 50, right? And so on and so on and so on. To make sure we understand what this is, when a quantity of 3, we have marginal revenue of 50. In your own words, explain at a quantity of 3 what marginal revenue of 50 represents. And then my next question is, let's go back to the demand curve. We've got an equation, we've got a table, we've got a graph. The vertical intercept is 100. What's the slope of this demand curve? The slope is negative 10. What does the slope represent? It represents how much price falls by when quantity increases by 1. And notice in the table that we can verify that information. When quantity increases by 1, it doesn't matter where we look on this list, but every time that quantity goes up by 1, prices are falling by $10. Yeah? But now hop over to this marginal revenue. What is the change from one line to the next of the marginal revenue? Every time that quantity increases by 1, the marginal revenue value is doing what? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. By how much? By 20. Marginal revenue is falling by 20. 20 is twice as large as negative 10. Negative 20 is twice as large as negative 10, right? More generally, this is the way that we identify the marginal revenue for a linear demand curve, meaning if you've got a straight line demand curve, which you always will in this class, if you have a linear demand curve, marginal revenue, this is how you do it. It has the same vertical intercept, but double the slope. So how do I do that? I take my marginal revenue curve, right now I'm going to do that in a different color, and I started out at the same value of 100, but I'm going to take the slope and double it. What does it look like if I double the slope? Is it steeper or flatter? It's actually twice as steep. And the other thing that's interesting is it crosses the horizontal intercept or the horizontal axis right at that halfway point. And that makes sense, right? Remember that marginal revenue is telling how much total revenue changes by, right? So what we're saying is that total revenue changes by a positive number, but a smaller positive number, positive number, positive number, positive number, but getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That absolutely fits the description of what's going on with this total revenue curve. Total revenue is going up, meaning it's positive, marginal revenue is positive, but it's going up at a decreasing rate until it hits a maximum. And then after the maximum, what's going on with the total revenue? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Marginal revenue is negative in those areas where total revenue is getting smaller and smaller. So it's not surprising that that point where marginal revenue crosses the axis, where it goes from positive to negative, is the point that corresponds to where total revenue is the highest. We can do a little bit of algebra to try to convince you of this. I'm going to do a little bit of a side note of an algebra for people who like a little bit more of the math orientation of this. If not, just go ahead and put your pen down and watch if you're not a super excited about the math. But in general, right, we've got a demand equation is telling us price as a function of quantity, and we're always going to consider a linear version of this. So we've got a constant term, and then we've got some slope, which is negative, times the quantity that's produced, right? And I can simplify that. P equals this. This is a linear version of my demand, right? This is my demand, but what we know for a monopolist is we want their total revenue. Total revenue is price times quantity. So what do I need to do? I need to take, this is an equation that describes the price. So if I have price times quantity, that's really saying A plus BQ times Q. And I can say that that's total revenue, and I can extend out this algebraically, AQ plus BQ squared. And marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. But if you've taken some calculus, you know that that's really just a derivative. And if you haven't taken calculus, don't stress about it. But can you take the derivative? For those of you who have seen calculus, could you real quickly take the derivative of this total revenue equation? AQ, the derivative with respect to Q, is just going to give you A, and plus BQ squared, if I took the derivative of that with respect to Q, right, I bring down my exponent, and so I've got plus 2B Q, and then reduce the exponent by 1, so 2 minus 1 is 1. So I've got marginal revenue is equal to A plus 2B Q. Compare the demand equation, A plus BQ, to the marginal revenue equation, A plus 2BQ. Same vertical intercept, twice the slope. Go back. It's totally fine if you're not into the math. This is the concept that you have to remember, right? That for a linear demand curve, marginal revenue, do the same vertical intercept, but double the slope. So to be specific about this, right? If I wanted to write out the equation for marginal revenue, I look at my demand equation, P equals 100 minus 10Q. Marginal revenue is same vertical intercept, so it's got the same constant term of 100, but now I need to double the slope, minus 20Q. When you're doing your problem sets, that's what you got to remember. In order to find the marginal revenue for a monopolist, you need to know what their demand curve is. And then once you know their demand curve, use the same vertical intercept, but double the slope. And that equation is going to describe the marginal revenue. And if you want to put it on a graph, it's going to look something like this. We are halfway to the story, right? So if you recall, when we had a perfectly competitive market, we had two graphs, right? On the left, we had a firm, and on the right, we had a market. And now we don't need to do that because we don't need to differentiate between a market and a firm. The monopolist is the only firm in the entire market. And so we don't need to differentiate. We can put them both on the same graph. I've got a U-shaped marginal cost curve right here. As another quick review, what determines the shape of the marginal cost curve? Right? And so as a hint, you probably want to go all the way back to when we connected the concept of productivity and cost. That'll help you remember what the connection is between this U-shaped marginal cost curve and something else that we looked at earlier, right? In general, though, this is the marginal cost curve. You remember what this represents, right? This is the cost of each of these additional units. hey, this could be the marginal cost curve of a perfectly competitive market. This could be the marginal cost curve of a monopolist. This could be a marginal cost curve of some other market structure. This cost curve, we don't usually assume that that's different between different market structures. What's different is the revenue side of the story. And so now we've got marginal cost. And if I have that this is the demand curve that the monopolist faces, could you add to this graph what the marginal revenue looks like? Right? So again, if we're going to add the marginal revenue, the rule is same vertical intercept, and then take and cut the horizontal in half so that you show twice the slope. That line right there is the marginal revenue curve. So now we've got everything we need in order to answer the number one most important question, right? Just like in a perfectly competitive market, the question was, what quantity should the monopolist produce to maximize profit? In a perfectly competitive market, we said, what quantity should the firm produce to maximize profit? Do you remember how we answer this question? It always, 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 to maximize profit, firms should set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. I like presenting this in a marginal story with marginal cost and marginal revenue, because if you recall, we can think about marginal revenue and marginal cost unit by unit, right? I can think about this very, very first unit for the monopolist, that very first unit. If I take that first quantity and I go all the way up to the marginal revenue, that is the marginal revenue for the first unit that monopolist is producing. In red, let's go up for that first unit to the marginal cost curve, and that is the marginal cost for this very first unit. So we can ask the question, rationally, should this monopolist produce the first unit? We can consider the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost, that area in green that I'm shading in. That's how much profit the monopolist is going to earn from that very, very first unit produced. Of course, they should make it rationally, right? Because the benefits outweigh the cost, right? So then let's move on to the next unit. Marginal revenue is a little bit lower, but it's still greater than the cost. So they're still adding to their pile of profit with making the second unit. Sure, they should go ahead and produce the second unit. How about the third unit or the fourth unit or the fifth unit? How about right here, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? Up to that point, we've got this is the marginal revenue. And even beyond it, this is the marginal revenue, and marginal revenue even becomes negative. And then in red, the costs of those units, and the extra profit that's produced by producing these additional units. The profit is getting smaller and smaller and smaller right to this point where the extra profit is zero. That right there, where the marginal revenue curve is equal to the marginal cost curve, that is the quantity, and in this case, this is the quantity the monopolist should produce to maximize profit. And again, I make this argument, could the monopolist produce beyond that point? They could, right? But think about the little bit of revenue that's generated from that unit, that next unit. The cost would be more than the revenue, and so that deficit that would be produced, right? That this would be a deficit. And the only way they could cover these extra costs is by dipping into some of these profits, and their profits would start getting lower, right? The firm, in this case, the monopolist, maximizes profit where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. U-shaped marginal cost curve, marginal revenue, that same vertical intercept and twice the slope. Find out where they intersect, and that's the quantity the monopolist should produce to maximize profit. So again, to review, I've got the quantity the monopolist should produce. I have the marginal revenue, which is the same vertical intercept as the demand, but twice as steep. I've got my U-shaped marginal cost curve where they intersect. That's the quantity the monopolist should produce to maximize profit. But now this is what I want to look at, right? If I take this quantity, this intersection point right there, what am I measuring right there actually, right? What's being measured right there? We've got two things. That's the intersection of two curves of marginal revenue and marginal cost. And those two things are equal to each other. At this intersection point, yes, that's step one, how I identify the quantity the monopolist should produce to maximize profit. But what that intersection point is telling me vertically is the value of marginal revenue and the value of marginal cost. It's not telling me, step two, the price they should charge. I have three curves on this: marginal revenue, marginal cost, and the demand curve. If you recall, the demand curve tells you for given quantities what's the price? The demand curve tells you all the different combinations of prices and quantity. So what do I need to do? What I need to do is I need to take this quantity where they intersect, and I go all the way up to the demand curve, and that value is what price they will charge, right? So again, marginal revenue equals marginal cost where they intersect. That's the quantity the monopolist will produce. But in order to find out the price that monopolist will charge, you need to take it all the way up to the demand curve. And that demand curve tells us, for a given quantity, what's the price the monopolist will charge. These are, again, remember, our market outcomes are prices and quantity. These are the prices and quantity of a monopolist. What I want to do is I want to compare it to a perfectly competitive market, right? We've got, and again, go back in your mind, you've got a firm, you've got a market. When we did a perfectly competitive market, this is what I want to compare it to, that market story. And we just had a demand curve and a supply curve, right? And we had P star and Q star in the market where supply and demand intersect. Do we have a demand in this monopoly graph? We do, right? This demand curve right here corresponds to that demand curve that we were considering for a market in a perfectly competitive market. As a question, is it realistic to assume that consumer demand doesn't depend on the market structure? Do you as a consumer care whether or not there are many different firms producing an item or whether there is one firm producing an item? And the caveat here is, given the same level of price, right? Given the same price, do you care whether it's one firm or 50 firms that are operating in the market? That's the assumption that we are considering right now, right? And so we've got our story about the demand curve. We need to focus on the other half of the story. In our market, we had a supply curve that was an upward sloping line. What's supply in this, right? If you recall from an earlier topic, marginal cost is the supply curve. This is the supply curve for a firm. The only thing that we have to assume in the background that's equivalent is that whatever the supply curve is in a perfectly competitive market, it's going to be a function of, it's going to depend on, it's going to be influenced by the cost structure of all of the firms in the market. We need to make an assumption, which may or may not be a realistic one, that the cost structure of the monopolist looks identical to the cost structure of all of those firms that are competing in a perfectly competitive market, that we're really just aggregating up, and that's what a monopolist's cost structure looks like. The reason why I say maybe that might not be a realistic is, gosh, didn't we assume some stuff about different costs with different sizes? So maybe it's not an okay assumption. But if it's something like the patent protected market, then maybe you might be able to make a stronger argument to saying that those costs between a monopoly and the competitive market with many firms, the cost structures are identical, and therefore this marginal cost is equivalent to the supply curve. So here we go. I'm going to add with a different color the perfectly competitive outcomes. This is the demand. We're assuming it's the equal demand for a competitive market. This is the supply, assuming it's the equal cost structure. Then where demand and supply intersect, actually let me make that a nice straight line so I don't muck that up. Where supply and demand intersect, that is, not being nice to me today, the quantity and the price. Where supply and demand intersect, we've been doing that for a bunch of topics now. Where supply and demand intersect horizontally, that's Q star. That's the quantity that gets bought and sold in a perfectly competitive market. Notice, how does that quantity compare to the quantity that a monopolist is going to produce? And then where they intersect vertically, that's our old friend P star, right? That's the prices that consumers end up paying in a perfectly competitive market. Notice, I mean, this is the intuition that we talked about that you already know. What does a monopolist do in the market? They hold back their output. Why are they holding back their output? Because they face the entire market demand, and so when they hold back their output, that's what allows them to jack their prices up above what a competitive market would produce. So again, we can sit and think about something like patent protections, right? Does this story of patent protection work? P star in blue, does that correspond to having a patent-protected drugs, or after the patent has expired when we've got the generic competition? The PMON in black, the price of a monopolist, does that correspond to when a drug company has a patent-protected drugs, or when they face the generic competition? The next thing we want to consider is not the market outcomes, but the welfare outcomes. So those are the things like the consumer surplus, producer surplus, right? So what I want to do is I want to first put in the welfare outcomes for a perfectly competitive market and then push those to the background. Again, recall, we were assuming that the cost structures are equal, so that the marginal cost of the monopolist is equal to the supply curve in the market. So therefore, right, actually, let's go ahead and do this. Where supply and demand intersect, that's the quantity in a perfectly competitive market, Q star, and where they intersect is also the price in a perfectly competitive market. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve down to the price consumers are paying, defined over all the units that consumers get to buy. So that right there is the consumer surplus. And the area below the price down to the supply curve, and realize that this supply curve is a U-shaped supply curve. I can still shade in the area. Could you feel comfortable coming up with the area of consumer surplus, this triangle? Probably, right? 1/2 base times height. Could you feel comfortable coming up with the area between price and this U-shaped marginal cost curve? Probably not, right? If you took Calc 2 and you think about integration, then this is just a simple little integration. You don't need Calc 2 for this. So my point is, I'm going to draw it like this, but I want you to recognize that that supply curve and the marginal cost curve, I'm drawing them as a U-shaped cost curve, but I am never going to give you a U-shaped cost equation, right? It's always going to be some other equation that's going to be a straight line that you could do. But for right now, I'm just highlighting it as a U-shaped cost curve. So I'm going to fill these in and then put them into the background, and then we'll, on top of it, compare these welfare outcomes to a monopoly outcome. All right, so we've got in the background, that's where consumer surplus, producer surplus is in a competitive market. Now, if we add the monopolist, right, we've got the demand curve, and so same vertical intercept, take the slope, double it, meaning take the horizontal intercept and cut it in half. That's the marginal revenue for a monopolist. And I've got marginal cost. What quantity should a monopolist produce to maximize profit? That's step 1. Find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's the quantity of a monopolist. And monopolists aren't going to produce as much. Are they not producing as much because they're mean and evil? No, actually, right? Go back for a second and convince yourself that they're not producing as much because if they did produce more, the revenue just wouldn't cover the costs, right? It's not that they're being mean and evil here. It's just simply that rationally, it doesn't make sense. Rationally, given that they have market in the power and given what their market structure looks like and given the implications for their marginal revenue, they have to hold back output if they want to continue acting rationally. This is the quantity they produce, and it corresponds to higher prices. And so then we can add those higher prices on the monopolist. Where is consumer surplus? With a monopoly, consumer surplus, I start at the demand curve and I'm going to go all the way down to the price consumers pay, but it's going to be these higher prices. And I shade over all the units that consumers get to buy. That's how many units consumers get to buy. Should be pretty obvious. Consumers unambiguously worse off, right? Consumers pay higher prices, and some consumers are no longer able to be able to find this. Some consumers won't buy the good anymore. So less is bought, a lower quantity, and higher prices. Both of those factors are pushing towards lower consumer surplus. Notice, where's producer surplus, though? This is a little bit interesting, right? Producer surplus starts at the price monopolists receive, which is going to be the PMON, and it's going to go all the way down to their supply curve, their marginal cost curve. But it's only defined over the units that are actually bought and sold. And so I ask you, does it look like that producer surplus that I just shaded in is larger or smaller than the original producer surplus, right? I think by this one it's pretty obvious but there is a little bit of ambiguity here, right? So I want to point out again, we've got this little area in yellow right there. who did that belong to and who does it now belong to, right? In a perfectly competitive market, that surplus would have been in the pockets of consumers. Now that surplus is in the pocket of producers. That area in yellow is just, again, a redistribution of economic value. That's not a big deal to me as an economist. I care about it, but not that much. I care about distributional issues, but they're not at the top of my mind. The efficiency is what is at the top of my mind, and that is where we want to talk about these other things. So, the monopolists, what do they do? What do they have to do in order to achieve higher prices? They have to hold back output, and it's a rational decision on their part. But when they hold back output, that means this consumer surplus, it's no longer created, and this producer surplus, it's no longer created. We have a name for surplus that used to be part of the market, and now something has happened where it's no longer there. This is a deadweight loss. This is specifically a deadweight loss from having a monopoly. Whenever there is a monopoly, if they are acting rationally, they will create a deadweight loss. And again, in the background, the demand curve tells me the benefits of production for consumers. This is the supply curve, and it does tell the costs of production. From an allocative efficiency standpoint, is it rational for the market to stop at this point? Not at all, right? We could have additional rational production beyond that point. So again, careful with the words here. For the market, this is not rational to have this low level of production. For the monopolist, it is rational, right? There's this tension. The monopolist is simply doing, with their power, given their cost structure, given the impact on their marginal revenue, they're acting completely rational from their perspective. But from a larger societal perspective, that's not rational, right? From an allocative societal perspective, there's this inefficiency that's created from the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is there, and that's one of those things that as an economist, is my top concern, is not having this inefficiency in the market. So we can ask a couple of bigger questions. Why would we ever want to create a monopoly, right? So I said half a second ago that every time we have a monopoly, there's going to be this deadweight loss that's created. There will be this inefficiency that's created. It's always going to be there. But remember that sometimes the government creates a monopoly. Why would we as a society be comfortable with having these monopolies created sometimes, right? So we've already identified what the cost of a monopolist is. We just identified it, right? What's the cost? It's the inefficiency. It's the deadweight loss that happens from it. What are the potential benefits, though? Again, if we think about a little drug development story, right? If we have drugs that are being developed, typically those are huge costs, right? Some of the latest estimates that I saw when I looked at the research, the drug development process that we talked about earlier, and again, realize there's a lot of failure based into this, and this is statistics that are coming from the industry, and so they have maybe a little bit of an incentive to inflate their numbers, but 1.2 billion with a B dollars on average to produce a drug. To have a drug go through the drug development process, I should say, right, and the drug approval process. It is a huge amount of money that they have to spend in order to do the background research to get the drug together, and then the FDA has a number of different rounds of testing that the drug has to go through successfully. It's a humongous effort to get a new drug to the market. It's not just a humongous effort, it's a very costly effort. Huge amount of money. What's the payoff for a drug company when they get a drug through the drug development process and it's a patent protected drug and it doesn't have to compete with the monopolists? Yeah, we collectively are going to experience this cost of this deadweight loss of this economic efficiency. But what if we didn't have patents protecting these drugs, creating these monopolies, right? If we didn't have a patent protected system that created this monopoly for drug companies for a few years that allowed them to generate above average prices to pay for all the upfront R&D, would they have an incentive to develop new drugs, right? And so that's the big argument for having these kinds of monopolies related to patent protections and things like that. Yeah, it's going to create a monopoly, but innovation, right? It's that new product development, it's that innovation. If we didn't have the monopolies, we wouldn't have innovation. And so why are we comfortable from a public policy perspective? I'm saying collectively, we in the US, we have this system of patents and we collectively are happy with it. Why? Because it encourages innovation and new product development. And so it's kind of like we're balancing these two effects, right? We're trying to balance having patent protection, which creates a monopoly, which is going to be an incentive for innovation against the potential deadweight loss of having those monopolists, right? We're trying to figure out, do we have the right balance? And periodically, we might want to take a look at the length of patent protection and to whether or not it's important. And so my final question for you in this section is, think about what would happen if we in the US extended patent protection for drugs. What's that going to do to the costs? What's that going to do to the benefits? Describe in your own words. What's it going to look like if we extend patent protection to a longer time period? And then you can also consider in your mind, what if we reduced patent protection?